we have Dunkin' Donuts cards. Talk about something silly, but a Dunkin' Donuts card, which is, $5 you can give to somebody, and it lets them go into Dunkin' Donuts to get a cup of coffee. It's inflation, it's probably not that much anymore, but and then they can sit in the warmth and use a bathroom. So a little card like that is a ticket to something that is really important to people. So we found that almost more than giving them $1 or $5, a Dunkin' Donuts card is really fabulous. And that's something we can all do. But I think it's just in Boston and Cambridge, I think just acknowledging people and acknowledge that they're alive is really important.
Hello and a warm welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live from First Parish Church in Harvard Square, and greetings to all our online audience. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're grappling with a pervasive problem right here in Cambridge, in Boston, but also nationwide. The pressing issue of how to bring medical attention to the homeless. We're fortunate to have Tracy Kidder, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, here today to discuss his new book, Rough Sleepers. The book centers around the work of one amazing man, Dr. Jim O'Connell, whose lifetime mission has been bringing medical attention and friendship to the dispossessed on the streets of Boston. Kidder's book is the result of spending 5 years shadowing O'Connell's work, bringing medical care, socks, soup, humour and a listening ear to some of the city's most endangered individuals. Much as he did in the profile of Paul Farmer, Kidder likes to explore small but dedicated groups of people who improve and gladden thousands of our lives by facing some of America's most difficult problems, rather than looking away from them. Tracy Kidder graduated from Harvard and studied at the University of Iowa. In addition to the Pulitzer Prize, Kidder has won numerous literary awards, and his books include Mountains Beyond Mountains, Strength in What Remains, The Soul of a New Machine, and A Truck Full of Money. Welcome, Tracy.
This is it. Hey, thanks. I think I'm going to reiterate the stuff about stories here. A few years ago, someone told me I was a purposive writer. I think what she meant was kind of writing that aims to expose and analyze problems and offer solutions, but I don't deserve that compliment. I've learned from people who write theoretically. I'm forever in their debt, but I have a hard time bending my mind around generalizations. Often all I can think of are the exceptions. To me, the sheer scale of the big subjects like homelessness or war, it make them incomprehensible by one approach alone. I don't think you could pretend to understand the Great Depression just by reading The Grapes of Wrath, but I also don't think that you could understand an event like the Holocaust without reading at least one narrative of an individual life that was got enmeshed in the Holocaust, such as in Primo Levi's great novel, The Periodic Table. Stories about individuals can be a window on large issues and events, a means, to borrow from William Blake, to see a world in a grain of sand. I think we're born with special equipment for telling and receiving stories. Stories are one way we organize the world's chaos, and one way in which we pass that information on from generation to generation. The best stories are living monuments to memories that ought to be preserved, and they don't need any other justification, in my opinion. But other justifications exist. I used to think that the most important job for a writer of stories was to get life on the page, and then my wonderful and now dead editor explained that I was wrong. He said that the real trick was to get life off the page and into the reader's imagination. And when that happens, readers are able to imagine other lives, including the suffering of other people. His stories can be a road to empathy. And empathy, I think, is one one means, but only one one of the ingredients anyway for relieving suffering. By training on all the Dickens novels my mother used to read me, and by inclination and probably by deficiency, I understand the world best through stories. And because the engine of any story is human character, I spent most of my years as a writer looking, first of all, not for subjects, but for people, interesting people. Mostly, though, to be honest, I haven't found them by looking for them. I've just run into them. For instance, a small town cop whom I first met because I was speeding. My wife met him the same day and for the same reason, but he didn't give her a ticket. And when I discovered that, I found him and asked him why, and he said quite sincerely that he didn't like to give women tickets because he hated to see women cry. I thought that was interesting and a good reason to continue. There was a pair of old men sharing a nursing home room, spending their time in that vestibule to eternity doing something more interesting and more difficult than playing bingo, which was making friends. There was a team of computer engineers in the early days of what were called mini computers, a subject that my editor, Dick Todd, sent me to, and I was really dubious because it seemed so boring. I was sure it would be boring, but then but these engineers were building a new computer basically against their company's wishes, and I gathered from one of the engineers took me aside and started telling me about the history of this, what he called the wars. And he used all this martial language. There was blood on the floor. There were people who shot from the hip. I thought that was kind of interesting because it looked to me like he was just making immobile plastic metal boxes, you know. There were, who else? I once wrote a book about the building of a house. An idea I got from having been my own incompetent and actually really nearly suicidal carpenter for a time. But what fascinated me once I got into it were the carpenters and also the homeowners and this architect and the relations among them, a menage a trois without sexual connotations. My book, Mountains Beyond Mountains, began when, quite by accident, I ran into Paul Farmer in Haiti. And you know, soon enough, in all of these cases, I got interested in the subjects that preoccupied these people. I first met Jim O'Connell, the guy over here, in 2014. I was working on a book about a Boston entrepreneur named Paul English, the founder of kayak.com, one of the founders. He had wanted to learn about homelessness in Boston, and he'd been directed to Jim, who was the president of the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program, which he calls the program. Jim had offered him a ride on one of the outreach vans that goes out from, there are two that go out from the Pine Street Inn, New England's largest homeless shelter, every night of the year. I tagged along on the trip, and I was struck by the relationships between a Harvard-educated doctor and his patients, and the people whom he encountered on the nighttime streets, mostly patients of his. These were people who were sleeping in doorways. One of them was arguing with a statue, I remember. I had barely spoken to such people and had congratulated myself when I had. For me, this night's tour was a glimpse of a world hidden in plain sight. I was left with a memory of vivid faces and voices and with a general impression of harsh survival leavened by the affection between a doctor and his patients. Afterward, I wondered if I'd just misremembered or misunderstood, and I asked for another ride some months later, and Jim, and I went out alone with him, and I spent a lot of the next 5 years in his company, equipped with a notebook and a digital recorder. My book begins with an incident I witnessed on that second ride on the van. If, with your indulgence, I'll read the passage. Just really. Around 10 on a warm September night, The outreach van stopped in the kind of South Boston neighborhood said to be in transition. On one side of the street was a new apartment building, its windows glowing, its sidewalk lit by artful imitations of old-fashioned street lamps. On the other side, in murky light, stood an abandoned loading dock. A heap of blankets lay on the concrete platform. Somebody passing by wouldn't have known there were anything but discarded blankets. But when the driver of the van walked up the steps and spoke to them, saying he was doing a wellness check, a muffled voice came back from underneath, and I don't see any children here, so I won't. That voice came back from underneath saying, "Fuck you, get the fuck out of here." The driver turned away and shrugged to Dr. Jim O'Connell, who was standing at the bottom of the steps. Let me try, the doctor said, and he climbed up to the platform and knelt by the gray mound. "Hey, Johnny, it's Jim O'Connell. I haven't seen you in a long time. I just want to make sure you're all right." An earthquake in the blankets, then an eruption, tangled hair and a bright red face and a loud voice saying in a Boston accent, "Dr. Jim, how the hell are you?" For the next half hour, Johnny reminisced about the alcohol-fueled adventures of his past, about mutual old friends mostly dead. The doctor listened, laughing now and then. He reminded Johnny that the street clinic was still open on Thursdays at Mass General. Johnny should come. That is, if he wanted to come. Dr. Jim James Joseph O'Connell had been riding on the outreach van for 3 decades. During those years, he had built with many friends and colleagues a large medical organization, which he called the Program. It now had about 400 employees and looked after about 11,000 homeless people a year. Jim was its president and also captain of the street team, a small piece of the program with 8 members serving several hundred homeless people who shunned the city's many shelters and lived mainly outside or in makeshift quarters all year round. About half of Jim's administrative work now lay in managing the street team, and all of his clinical work went to doctoring its patients, Boston's rough sleepers, as Jim liked to call them, borrowing the British term from the 19th century. The van was a crucial tool for reaching those patients. It was financed by the state and managed by the Pine Street Inn. They had become an institution. The vans had become an institution, which Jim helped to foster in the late 1980s. Back then, he used to ride 2 or 3 nights a week, usually until dawn. Now he went out only on Monday nights and got off around midnight. When he had begun these tours on the van through Boston's nighttime streets, he had imagined the world of rough sleepers as a chaos, but it turned out that most of them had territories where they hung around and panhandled during the day. Stemming was the street term, its etymology obscure. For sleeping, they had favorite doorways, park benches, alleys, understories of bridges, ATM parlors. Rough sleepers were like homebodies without homes. At the start of a ride, Jim and the driver's assistant would trade the names of people they were worried about, and they could usually find each of them within an hour or 2. Jim was like a 1950s doctor making house calls, though the van rarely dispensed more than minor medicine. Rather, it was meant for bringing food and blankets and socks and underwear to rough sleepers, and more urgently, for finding people in distress and bringing them in, if they would come, to hospital emergency rooms or the city's homeless shelters. The van was also a tool for keeping in touch with patients and their ailments and collecting the unpublished news of the streets. Like all members of the street team, Jim carried a small knapsack, his doctor's bag, its contents refined and miniaturized over the years. It consisted mostly of basic first aid gear and diagnostic equipment, a blood pressure cuff that wrapped around the wrist, a little pulse oximeter, an ear thermometer, a simple blood glucose meter, a stethoscope. Among the losses he regretted was the pint bottle of whiskey he once carried for the times when a patient was in alcohol withdrawal and on the verge of seizure. He couldn't do that now, he said. It's become a moral issue. He wore his cell phone in a holster on his hip, and he carried a small flashlight thin enough to hold in his teeth if he needed both hands to examine a patient. A flashlight remained one of the street team's essential tools for checking on rough sleepers. Some years back, one patient had asked how Dr. Jim would feel if his doctor came to his bedroom in the middle of the night and woke him up by shining a flashlight in his face. Jim took the issue to the program's board of directors, a group of about 16, which included experts in health and medicine and finance, and several formerly homeless people. The board convened a meeting of about 30 rough sleepers who issued this advice, long since become policy. The wellness checks should continue, but when they woke people up late at night, Jim and his street team should first shine their flashlights on their own faces so as not to startle the patients. Let's go from there.
Thanks, Tracy. And now, of course, it's my honour to introduce a person who doesn't need any more introduction. However, also a few words, because he is a man, above all, of incredible humility. He is president of the Boston Healthcare and assistant professor of medicine at Harvard. In 1985, he became the founding physician for Boston Healthcare for the Homeless. This now serves 13,000 homeless persons a year in 2 hospital-based clinics, the Boston Medical Center and MGH, plus other outreach, 60 other outreach. Dr. Jim has received numerous awards, including the Albert Schweitzer Humanitarian Award in 2012, and he's collaborated with homeless programs around many cities in the United States and indeed the world, from London to Sydney. He took his first job serving the homeless because he felt he couldn't refuse, but that year turned into a lifetime mission, working on the streets of Boston and in his Thursday Street Clinic. Now in his 70s, believe it or not, Dr. Jim is still captain of the street team, providing care and attention to the sick and forgotten. Let me introduce Dr. Jim in person.
So first of all, Mary, thank you very much for having us. So I sit here exquisitely embarrassed and wish I could be out there, not in here. But I just want to say thank you for being here, and listening to what Tracy just said just brings back a whole flood of memories. And I think what I'm mostly looking for is to just get in a dialogue. So I don't want to start with anything. Maybe I would say that to those of you who know me, that this truly was an accidental turn in the journey of my own life. I really wanted to do something. I wanted to stay within hospital medicine and do a specialty kind of thing. And I literally got told to do this job for a year back in 1985 by my really wonderful chief of medicine, whose name was Dr. John Potts, and another really amazing doctor who was a mentor of mine named Dr. Tom Durant. And they had been involved with Mayor Flynn in trying to get a grant for the city of Boston to try to take care of this kind of growing population of homeless people that were coming into the emergency room with presumably no care beforehand and no preventive care. So they wanted to see if they couldn't integrate the care of that group of people into the mainstream of homeless medicine. So I decided I would do this for a year. It would be my year of giving back. I was a child of the late 60s, feeling exquisitely guilty about lots of things. So I wanted to give back. And I started doing it, and as Tracy knows, it didn't take very long to realize that this was something I knew nothing about. It was the medicine was way complicated. We had an outbreak of multi-drug tuberculosis at the same time the AIDS epidemic was becoming pervasive in the homeless population. And then most people had not seen doctors in years. So we were seeing all these, a combination of kind of everyday things that hadn't been taken care of for years, and these kind of exquisite things like scurvy that you wouldn't generally see except in reading. We read about it in textbooks, but didn't see it often. So it was a really compellingly complex job. But what grabbed us all eventually, through lots and lots of time and energy, was the stories of the people we were seeing. And it's those stories that I now, cherish more than anything else in that. And I'll stop there because I think we should really invite Tracy in on this one.
One of the most fascinating things I read about you was you said that bartending. I apologize. Can you hear me? Is that better? Okay. I'll do that again.
Just divided opinions.
as always in Cambridge. One of the most fascinating things I read about you was you said that bartending, which you did to put yourself through medical school, taught you perhaps more than any medical class about dealing with the homeless. And the quote was, if you're not willing to listen to lots of people talking at you, not all of them coherently, you'll go crazy tending a bar.
And I still stand by that, although I'm a little nervous of what my teachers at Harvard Medical School would say about that. But no, it is true. Think about it. When you're a bartender, you're stuck behind a bar. It's a very long night. People will sit down and just start talking to you. And as the night progresses, the conversations can go in all sorts of directions. But the most important thing is you will go crazy if you don't learn to like the stories and to listen to the stories and to be interested in them. So I found that was really the best training I had for entering the world that I didn't mean to enter.
No, there's an interesting thing about being a bartender. I've learned it's wonderful to learn all these things. You never wear a tie that's actually a real tie. It always is a clip-on tie. Just because someone
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true.
Any other little things we should know?
No, nothing else.
Well, I think it teaches you to be a great listener. Or maybe you were born a great listener.
No, I think it's a little combination of that, but it certainly taught me the patience to listen and let the story unfold in a way that took a lot longer time than I would have wanted. So I think the patience was in not pushing people to, move too fast. I also, I think there's something about, and I don't mean to push this metaphor too much, but there was something about, bartending, sort of the whole focus is on, getting someone a drink and then listening to them and making the experience good. That's how you earn your tips. And I think there's a parallel with that. When I was soaking feet with the nurses at Pine Street Inn, it was a little bit of this, not a little bit, it was a lot of the same thing, of taking time and being patient and really trying to find the fascinating and the interesting in what people were saying.
One of the things you mentioned in the book, Tracy, was that one of the first jobs you had, Jim, when you started this homeless clinic, was the nurse asked you to wash the feet of the homeless. And apart from the biblical metaphor right there can't be too many worse jobs, I imagine, if you think in the world of washing the feet of somebody who maybe has a diseased foot or maybe even have gangrene or all sorts of sores. How much did you learn from that?
First of all, I should, say thank you to the nurses, because I came out of the hospital, raring to go. I had been 4 years of medical school and 3 years of residency. I thought I was really good and ready to start doing things. And I left Mass General, went the 6 blocks down the road to Pine Street Inn, and was shocked when the nurses greeted me. And the nurses had had a clinic at Pine Street for many years before we ever showed up. And they weren't so sure they wanted to have a doctor on board. Their experience with doctors like me in the hospital was not particularly good. So led by Barbara, they sat me down and explained that we had been trained all wrong, that in the hospital and in our training, we usually have 10 or 15 minutes to get to know you, find out what your problem is, examine you, come up with a diagnosis and a treatment, and then move on to the next person. And the nurses were like, that will never work here. You've got to learn to slow down. And I realized it's a real art to slow down when you've been trained to be very efficient. And so what they made me do, and this is what the nurses did that was so compelling to me, and I didn't understand it until much later. But when you walked into the clinic at Pine Street, around the perimeter, they would have, the men would be sitting in chairs, those old chairs like we used to have in school, where the arm comes out like this. I remember it well because I'm a left-hander and they always were right-handed, so you had to leave your arm over that. And they would soak the feet of these men. It was the men's side of Pine Street. And I was stunned by how peaceful and quiet everything was compared to the chaos out in the lobby. And then nurses, what Barbara said to me was, you need to get to know people. You have to take time. And you've got to give a little bit of yourself. You've got to share your stories. You've got to have some coffee with people, but you've got to be consistent. and be here. And I remember, thinking, okay, I can try this, but it's not exactly the ICU that I just come from, So, but what I remember is the brilliance of the nurses was that it put you at the foot of the person you're caring for, a long way from their personal space. And it allowed the person you're serving to really be in charge of what they want to do. So I wasn't allowed to ask any questions like, are you having chest pain? Are you hearing voices? That was not allowed. You just said, what else can I do for you? Anything else you need? And it was kind of brilliant. So after, I had to do that for 2 months as an apprenticeship. And what I remember first is the smell was horrible, okay? And I knew that I'd probably made a big mistake. But then I started to learn that by looking at people's feet, first of all, there's a ton of illnesses that you can diagnose by how their feet look. And you start to understand what they've been going through and what their lives are like. And as we came to learn, all of us in our program started to see that the feet are sort of the gateway to the soul. And you can learn it's a way to begin to care for people. So my hat is tipped to the nurses who taught us that way back 38 years ago.
So you had other ways of winning over the confidence of the homeless people that you were working with. One was listening. You made a point of saying you befriended them, which is quite a big word. And you also went the extra mile. You'd often slip them $20. Do you still do that?
I never had $20 in the beginning. I used to have like $1. Okay, let's talk about. But yeah, and I was thinking of the representative was talking about the cash, what the state is doing now, that people when they can spend money the way they want to. So I wasn't at that level, but I was struck by the poverty. When we first opened our respite program, for example, we had people that we would ask to stay there. And then I'd start to realize they had not a cent in the world, not someone who was going to give them any, nothing in the bank. And when they were in our respite program, they couldn't go outside and stem for their own money. And so when the truck would come up, with the food, they couldn't even go out and get food. So I remember I first started giving people money so that they would have something so they could go out and get a cup of coffee or a candy bar. And I kind of had been taught that by, and I'm going to call out Barbara McGinnis and Kip Tiernan, who was on our board of directors. I don't know if any of you remember Kip, who founded Rosie's Place, absolutely ferocious, fabulous advocate. And Sister Margaret from Project Hope down at Dudley Square, which is now Nubian Square. They were all, they had been doing this forever, and they all would hit me up to give some money to different people. So I think I grew up in a world where handing out $1 or a $5 bill was kind of helpful to someone who had otherwise nothing in the world. And I realize it has become it's a little bit, pushes boundaries a little bit, that I totally acknowledge. But
sometimes you just drop it in the bag, right, rather than hand it.
Yeah, you try not to let it. One of the themes of our program is we were not supposed to be about charity. We were supposed to be about justice, social. This was the homeless. We were blessed because, as Tracy knows, and knows many of them well, the people on our board of directors, many of them are homeless or have been homeless themselves. And we learn most of what we're doing from what they tell us to do. I can give you an example if anyone's interested, but we used to say medical care, mental health care, and substance use care. And it's been changed now, appropriately to behavioral health. But our board of directors does not like that because they think we think we're impugning their behavior, when in fact it may be their mood or their thoughts. So they won't let us say behavioral health anymore, even though that's the appropriate thing to say. So they pretty much tell us what to do. And, and I think, that's the learning that I've had through this has all been upside down. I haven't really thought it through. I've been told to do that and then have done it. And it's worked out for me to be nice. I used to give out $1 or $5, and I thought someday when I have more money, I'm going to give more money. That's how I felt.
I think there's something interesting about that. Some people, we all have our own ways of doing things. And I think when I've heard Jim speak about this, I have a grandson who says to me, "Pa, do you have any money?" I give him money. He has all these friends in Jamaica Plain he gives money to. He does it in the most natural way. It's fine. There are people, I mean, there are lots and lots of different approaches. And if you think, well, I'm not going to give this man money because he might go and buy drugs with it, that's fine. But I would be caution those who feel that way, just to remember that they haven't done anything and they shouldn't walk off with too great a sense of accomplishment. And also to give one of the most moving, most important moments in the stories that I saw about this one man who became terribly important to me was when Jim actually did break a promise and gave him some money that he needed. And it was really a prescription. It wasn't, and it was partly because this was a person who was trying to go straight. He was trying to find a place in the world. He was really ardent about it, and he was really working hard to try to do this with absolutely no hope, really. I mean, no hope. I had very little hope that he would be able to get there. But one of the things that a human being has is gift-giving power, a full human being. And that's really what Jim was trying to give him, because he was constantly giving stuff away, this guy. It was terribly important. It's terribly important to most people. So I see no harm in giving some money away. And besides, these should be gifts given freely. I'm sorry, this is my opinion, but all my opinions really come from him on these subjects. He's like my nurse, my Barbara McGinnis, sort of.
So has he really been a teacher or a mentor in your life? Jim? I mean, what did you learn from him in the 5 years that you were out together?
What did I learn from him? Oh, all sorts of things. I was just talking about one of them, actually.
Yeah.
I don't know. Well, I learned that I'm a pretty bad listener myself, by comparison. I often recorded conversations with a digital recorder. When I've gone back to listen to them, I find myself, I'm asking him questions, and I find myself saying to myself, "Shut up, just shut up." So I don't know, all sorts of things about what this problem is, his view of the general problem, which I share, and I don't know, stories from the past seem to me quite revealing. I don't know, all sorts of things. They're all in my book. Read my book.
Well, we have a few questions have already come in on Zoom, but I just wanted to add some more to that about learning. I'm sure you've been 40 years almost doing this work now. Do you ever have sort of regrets that you took this path, or does that never cross your mind?
No, I do not have any regrets. I sometimes am astonished or maybe astounded that it turned out this way. But I think after the first year, so one of the things that I should point out, that when I got into this, not understanding anything and learning from the nurses what was going on, one of the key things that people were asking for was, will you stick with us? Will you be continuous? And at the time, what I remember, I was just doing this for a year, and I was going to go on and do my life. I was going to go become a specialist. So this was clearly just a year to give back. But I was caring for people who were not interested in that. And they weren't so interested in opening up and sharing with me and doing all the things that we really want them to do so that we could care well for them. And they didn't want to do that if I was just going to get up and go leave after a year. So I remember that first year was incredibly tense because I was coping with that. But somewhere along the way, I realized that I was starting to gain so much more than I had understood, because people were opening up and sharing with me. And I was learning astonishing things about what people had been through. I grew up without much money, but we weren't in desperate poverty. And these are folks who had lived through unbelievable stresses as children, abuse of all kinds, physical, sexual, emotional, poor schooling, living in blighted areas, foster care that didn't work out. And you start to realize, I was so blessed in what I had been given. And as I got to know them, they had been reluctant at first, and over time they started to open up and become kind of tell me what was going on. And I felt like I was a doctor who was also becoming a friend and someone who would be there for him. So I think what happened is once I got into that tract, I was dead set on how do you make this a career? How can you stick with it? And what I was mostly worried about is how do you sustain that? How can we make that something? So I stopped thinking about, what I was going to do, and this became my kind of truly accidental goal in Korea.
I can answer your question now. It just came to me. The biggest thing I really did learn was what really good medicine looks like. And it's what, sadly, in some ways, because of the generosity of many donors and the generosity of our state when it comes to Medicaid, which is, unparalleled in this very stingy parts of our country. Because of that, and because of the necessity to spend time with patients if you're trying to treat homeless patients, because otherwise if you don't, you won't have any patients. I venture to say that those 13,000, however many unduplicated patients the program deals with each year probably receive better medical care than almost anyone else in the state. I don't think that's a bad thing, that they should receive it, but I think others should receive it. And I think Jim once said this to me, that perhaps there are things that medicine could learn from our program. I think there are a lot of things medicine could, or relearn from the program. We really must stop this corporate control of medicine, this whole introduction of corporate measures of work rules it's just terrible. Doctors hate it, patients hate it. Most doctors hate it, most patients hate it. And I think they have good reason to. So I think come and see this. It's really quite remarkable. There are other things.
I do. I think it's interesting because today in Harvard Magazine, they were talking about how do you teach compassion to doctors? Can you teach compassion? Because it's the thing that's lacking most because of the lack of time, not because of anything else. How do you do that, Jim? I mean, that's a large part of what you need to do to administer medicine to the homeless.
I honestly don't think you can teach compassion, but you can show compassion and people can witness it. So I think one of the joys in our life is to have the students, students of lots of things, some nursing students, PA and nurse practitioner students, and particularly medical students, and give them a chance to see what it's like to take time and get to know people as opposed to be on the grind as I was, and most of my friends still are. And when you see compassion, I think then you begin to learn it. But I've never found a way that you can tell people this is what you should do to be compassionate. It doesn't seem to ever work. So I think it's an experience, and that's what one of our real goals is to make sure we can offer an experience to a young person in the profession where they can see what it's like to care for people.
Have other communities adopted your methods?
Absolutely. And, there's, I was thinking here in Cambridge, there is a sister organization, a Healthcare for the Homeless program led by Mark McGovern. I don't know if Mark is actually here tonight, but that works out of Cambridge Hospital and does just the same kind of care. We've been working together for a long time. So there are many cities around the country that are, have similar programs to ours. Because of the difference in politics and healthcare issues and Medicaid issues, they all look a little bit different. But I think the integration of the effort to reach out and provide the best care we can to people who have the least is a universal thing in many cities, and we're all trying hard. I think we're lucky here in Cambridge and Boston because the community, the state and the cities and the hospitals and the shelters have all been really partners in doing this, and I think that's what we really need. So we're blessed. That is not common in many other cities.
We've had a couple of questions that overlap. My heart goes out to folks living rough. What are some of the responses I can make to help the person or the situation? That's
a question I asked Barbara McGinnis in 1985. And, this is a tough situation, but our approach has been, since we're in it every day, is to realize you can't give the need is huge. You can't address the huge need. But what you can do is when people approach you and you see them, is to acknowledge them. And even if you don't give them anything, just to say hello and just acknowledge that they're human beings. And I say that, at first I said that's kind of corny, but, when you talk to our board members, what they're mostly looking for, what they mostly feel is when they're outside, they feel invisible. And so when they're asking for money, they would love to get money, but they hate it when people just look away and pretend they're not asking. So we try hard to just look directly at people and acknowledge them, and give something if you can, or as you get to know them over time, give something. So by the way, as you're saying all this, I realize that, we have Dunkin' Donuts cards. Talk about something silly, but a Dunkin' Donuts card, which is, $5 you can give to somebody, and it lets them go into Dunkin' Donuts to get a cup of coffee. It's inflation, it's probably not that much anymore, but, and then they can sit in the warmth and use a bathroom. So a little card like that is a ticket to something that is really important to people. So we found that almost more than giving them $1 or $5, a Dunkin' Donuts card is really fabulous. And that's something we can all do. But I think it's just in Boston and Cambridge, I think just acknowledging people and acknowledge that they're alive is really important.
How do you personally avoid burnout?
I work in a really fabulous team and among a whole bunch of people that are really dedicated. And I think it was much harder when we were alone and only a few. And as we've grown, I work with this incredible team with a couple of other doctors, a psychiatrist, a recovery coach, a peer specialist, and we all care for the same people. So you can sustain yourself in a way that I think if I was in a private practice all by myself, I might burn out quickly. So I think we've cheated and we've learned that a team care, which we are required to do, really is a little bit of a buffer from burning out. That said, though, as Tracy knows all too well, death is ubiquitous in our world. And as I look back over my career, I keep thinking of how many people I've been so attached to who are now dead. And that just wears away at you, I think, more than anything else. So coping with, how cruel homelessness can be to people's souls and bodies really is the hardest thing to deal with.
Any ideas for persuading towns that insist on NIMBY, not in my backyard?
I mean, you got a hard problem right here in Boston, right across the river. Think about I don't want to sound too self-righteous, but think about the seaport, one of the most disastrously ill-designed new neighborhoods in the city. I mean, brand new practically. Nobody thought much about transportation, I guess. I mean, it's almost impossible to get in and out of there. And I don't believe there's a single stick of truly affordable housing in that part of town. There are an awful lot of lights that are a lot of dark windows at night.
What are the details of homeless people's lives? Where do they sleep? How do they find friends? Feelings about seeking help and money?
Let me take a take on that. There was an argument I remember in the literature about whether there is a community of homeless people or not, whether what goes on outside. And I actually have come to believe and acknowledge and cherish that there is a community of people outside. What is interesting to me is as we try desperately now to get people into housing, off the streets and into housing, which is really the way to end the homelessness for each individual, at least hopefully. What we're finding is when people go into housing, they often lose their community. They lose the skills that they had honed so finely on the streets. They lose the people that acknowledge them as they come back and forth. And then they are alone in an apartment in a neighborhood they're not very sure of. And we're finding that that's when we start to realize understanding their lives becomes most important, and giving them a new community, a purpose in life, some hope is what becomes a challenge. But I think when people get into housing, you start to understand what was really going on in the streets and back and forth. So there's a lot for, I think, all of us to learn, including ourselves, which we're only unwinding now. I think the whole new frontier is understanding how, once we get people into housing, what do they need to sustain that kind of housing? What kind of services? What kind of support?
How have the street people changed since when you first started? For example, more or different drug use, different illnesses, new resources for help? Martha asks this.
That's an interesting question. So what I would say is, for the longest time, when I would go out with the Pine Street van, by the way, if there are heroes in this story, it's not us, it's the people that are out every night on this van. And they know everybody who's outside. They're out from 9 o'clock at night till 5 in the morning, as Tracy said, every night of the week. What I remember, the rough sleepers, the hardcore rough sleepers, back when I first got to know them, were mostly, by the way, it's mostly men. There's about 4 men to every woman outside. Their demographics completely reflected the demographics of Boston as a whole. So as if everybody filtered down equally. The number of medical problems was astronomical, heart disease, diabetes, lung disease, liver disease. And we did not see many heroin addicts. We saw mostly people drinking, and smoking was universal. And then there was a level of chronic mental illness that was pervasive outside as well. And I think as time has gone on, we've seen many of the older, particularly those who are drinking alcohol, have sort of faded away, and we've seen much more of a drug-using community emerge. So that, I think, is a fundamental change. I think the background level of mental illness has stayed pretty much the same. But the demographics are starting to change. We're starting to see more of, different types of folks who are homeless. So it has evolved. What has been depressing for me in one way is that I would say for the first 30 years I've been doing this, I knew just about everybody on the streets. And since the opioid epidemic, and since COVID, and since, all the other factors going on, now we see a sort of a different group of people on the street who we don't know that well. We're getting to know them all over again. So that's been the saddest part for me, is it's now, I feel like we're starting all over again, getting to know people.
So was that the decimation caused by the pandemic, that people have literally died off?
I think it's two things. I think the city has done, and I think Cambridge the same way, has done a really good job of taking those people who've been out homeless for a very long time and finding housing for them. And many, many of them have died. So I think the combination of premature mortality and getting people into housing has shifted the population, and now we're seeing a new population. That's a very crude observation. I haven't done any studies on that.
I've got one last question for you, Tracy. Somebody's asked, one chapter in Rough Sleepers is titled Death by Housing. Can you comment on permanent supportive housing, or Housing First, which provides housing with no prerequisites for treatment of addicts and substance abuse? Gerald?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about it. It's something, Jim, that I also learned from Jim. If I'm not mistaken, when Housing First began, there was rejoicing within the street team, within the program, indeed, because those people could never get housed, and people started getting housed. But one of the essential elements of Housing First is supportive. That word, supportive, and it just never was there, not sufficiently so. Some people can go into housing and they're just fine all by themselves, but there are others who can't. And part of it is that I have a wonderful woman who serves on the board of the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program, who failed her first time at housing. She remembered, she had forgotten everything about how you might keep an apartment clean. She told me she used to talk to her refrigerator, saying, what do I do next? Jim's wife, Jill, who just trying to help some people who had first gotten in there. She had to teach them how to turn on a TV, and she would get phone calls periodically saying, I've watched everything there is on TV, what do I do now? I mean, it was really, and there were people who, I mean, there was like one guy who pitched a tent when he got inside. There are these famous stories of a man who went outside and made recordings of the street noises at night to use as a lullaby so that he could sleep inside. I think, as Jim likes to say, a lot of these people have very highly honed skills for sleeping outside. They don't translate indoors. And there are other problems as well. I mean, if I'm not during the first days of
time to go.
Right, during the first days of Housing First, there were many deaths. Jim and now his wife Jill would go to apartments and they'd find the person dead. In some cases that was to be expected, and it felt like a good outcome because the person was very sick. But often it wasn't the case. I have one friend among the patient panel who told me, he said, when they put me inside, I don't know why I didn't die. It was so much easier to shoot up heroin. So you need it, and housing can be deadly if you don't get the proper support. That's what I meant by that thing. I am not philosophically an enemy of Housing First. It's obviously the right thing to do, but it ought to be done right. Has to be done right.
We're running out of time, but we have a last question. Do you work with young adults? Do young people go to you, or where are they served?
It's a great question. And in our program, our larger program, we have a family team that takes care of the families, and we have the adult shelter folks where we take care of the single and attached adults. In between, the adolescents are very well served, and we all fall in with that with Bridge Over Troubled Waters over in Boston. I'm not so sure who does it in Cambridge, but like Y2Y here. But we try very hard to keep that group out of the adult shelters and away from that kind of circum. So it's been for Bridge Over Troubled Waters was started by Sister Barbara Whalen probably in 1980, somewhere back then. So it's been really a nice way so we can funnel adolescents and runaways to a safer place for them to be rather than with us in the big shelters.
It's not working.
One of the questions that was just crossing my mind when you were talking about giving care, on top of all the infectious things and neglect issues, how many of the people you're treating have had incidents of violence or something inflicted on them because they're sleeping rough?
That's another great question, and I would say virtually all of them. It's to sleep outside unprotected, and in Boston, most people are sleeping in alleyways and park benches. We don't, until Mass and Cass, we didn't have any tent sort of, what am I trying to say, tent villages or something like that. So the incidence of violence is really high, and I would wager there's no one who's slept outside for years that hasn't had head trauma and body trauma from sleeping outside. By the way, just to let you know, when we look at death rates, we know that people living in the shelters of Boston, as in most cities around the country, they die at 4 times the rate of someone the same age in that city. But if you live outside in Boston, you die at 10 to 12 times. I think there may be a message coming here. You die at 10 to 12 times the rate of somebody. So living on the streets is deadly, and the premortality rates of people living on the streets rival those of most third world countries. And we have the richest healthcare system in the country right here.